Maplewood was the kind of town where time seemed to slow down. Nestled among rolling hills and towering oaks, its winding streets felt untouched by modern chaos. White picket fences, vibrant gardens, and cozy porches were not just part of the landscape, they were the very essence of life in this small town. Neighbors smiled at each other over fences, conversations were filled with good-natured laughter, and children played freely in backyards without a care in the world. For most residents, Maplewood was more than a home, it was a promise of stability. But beneath its perfectly trimmed hedges and flower-lined sidewalks, Maplewood carried with it an invisible wall, a boundary of unspoken rules. It was a place that prided itself on predictability, on the harmony of sameness. Outsiders, particularly those who looked or acted differently, were rare, and those who dared cross into Maplewood often found themselves the subjects of quiet scrutiny. Margaret Simmons knew Maplewood better than anyone else. She had spent the past 3 decades building her life here, pouring herself into the community as if the town itself was a family member. Her house, a pristine white colonial with navy blue shutters, sat proudly on Elmwood Lane. A blooming garden stretched across her front yard, bursting with hydrangeas, roses, and lilies she tended to daily. Margaret's home was the envy of the neighborhood, not because it was the largest, but because it was the most perfectly kept. For Margaret, life was a rhythm of routine, mornings in the garden with a cup of tea, afternoons spent overseeing the neighborhood, and evenings with a novel in hand. Her routine was sacred, and she took immense pride in maintaining the order Maplewood represented. It was that sacred calm, however, that shattered on a brisk autumn morning when a large white moving truck rumbled down Elmwood Lane. Margaret had just settled onto her garden bench, her steaming mug of Earl Grey nestled in her palms, when the sound of an engine broke the silence. She looked up sharply, her eyes narrowing as the truck slowed to a halt directly across the street. The house across from hers had been vacant for months, its previous owners having moved out quietly. The property had sat untouched, as if holding its breath, waiting for someone to claim it. Her brows furrowed deeply. Who could this be? She thought. Margaret's gaze sharpened as 2 movers hopped out of the truck and began unloading items, a sofa wrapped in protective padding, large crates, and what looked like a sculpture hidden beneath cloth. Then, from a sleek black SUV parked behind the truck, a tall man emerged. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. The man, no more than 40, was striking in appearance. His tailored charcoal suit and crisp white shirt gave him an air of quiet authority. There was something about the way he moved, calm yet deliberate, that unsettled Margaret. He paused to take in the house before walking briskly toward the movers, issuing instructions with a steady hand. The workers seemed to respond instantly, their pace quickening. Margaret leaned forward on the bench, straining to hear, though the distance made it impossible. Who does he think he is? She muttered to herself, feeling a flare of irritation. Her eyes narrowed further as the movers carefully unloaded a grand black piano. A piano? Margaret scoffed aloud. Who moves in with a piano? For a moment, she sat frozen, debating whether to approach and introduce herself as she would have done in years past. But something about the man, his confidence, his unfamiliarity, gave her pause. She rose briskly, abandoning her tea on the garden table, and marched back inside. Her curtains, which she had left tied back to let in the morning sun, were quickly drawn shut. From a drawer in the corner of her living room, Margaret retrieved an old pair of binoculars. She had kept them for birdwatching years ago, though they had long since gathered dust. She wiped the lenses clean with the edge of her cardigan and moved back to the window. Peering through the binoculars, Margaret felt her stomach tighten. The items being carried inside seemed too extravagant: paintings, antique-looking lamps, and that piano, which now sat in the center of the living room like an uninvited guest. But it wasn't just the possessions that unsettled her. It was the man himself. She watched as he walked to the back of his SUV, retrieving a large leather bag. His movements were fluid and purposeful. He seemed to carry himself with an air of someone who was accustomed to respect, or perhaps even authority. Authority over what? Over who? A chill ran down Margaret's spine as old memories surfaced unbidden, memories of the Peterson family who had once lived in the very same house. They, too, had been different, and Margaret had tried to welcome them, to make them fit into the quiet fabric of Maplewood. But misunderstandings had spiraled into disagreements, and the family left abruptly. The shame of that experience still sat like a stone in Margaret's chest. Not this time, she resolved, gripping the binoculars tighter. This time, I'll keep Maplewood safe. The morning ticked by slowly, but Margaret couldn't tear herself away from the window. She watched as the movers finished their work, shaking hands with the man before climbing back into their truck and driving off. Alone now, the man surveyed his front yard with a faint smile, as if taking stock of his new domain. Margaret's phone rang suddenly, jolting her out of her vigil. She let out a shaky breath and picked up the receiver. Margaret? It's Laura. Margaret sighed, relieved to hear her old friend's voice. Laura, you won't believe what's happening across the street, she said breathlessly. What now? Laura asked, her tone teasing. A man moved in. Out of nowhere. He didn't say a word to anyone, just brought in boxes and, Margaret paused dramatically. A piano. A piano? Margaret, you're overreacting again, Laura chuckled. I'm not. Margaret insisted. He's different, Laura. He doesn't belong here. You said the same thing about the Petersons, Laura reminded her gently. This is different, Margaret snapped. I know it. Laura sighed on the other end. Well, if you're that worried, why don't you just ask him who he is? The idea was absurd to Margaret. I can't just walk over there and ask him. Then you'll have to wait and see, won't you? Laura replied with a hint of finality. Give the man a chance, Margaret. But Margaret's mind was already elsewhere. Her binoculars were once again pressed to her face, and she saw the man on his phone, pacing the yard. Though she couldn't hear the conversation, something about the intensity of his tone made her uneasy. The day passed slowly, and by evening, Margaret's vigilance had grown into something more, a growing sense of unease she couldn't shake. As darkness fell over Maplewood and the streetlights flickered to life, Margaret sat alone in her living room, the phone receiver gripped tightly in her hand. Her heart raced as Laura's words echoed in her mind, if you're worried, call the police. Margaret hesitated, her thumb hovering over the dial pad. What if I'm right? She thought. What if he really doesn't belong here? Before she could second-guess herself, Margaret dialed the number for the local police. Maplewood Police Department, a calm voice answered. Margaret took a deep breath. Hello. I'd like to report some suspicious activity. The Maplewood streets were painted gold by the evening sun as the police patrol car pulled onto Elmwood Lane. The quiet neighborhood stood still, its picturesque homes bathed in the waning light. Birds chirped in the distance, but for Margaret Simmons, who watched intently from her living room window, the silence carried an edge of anticipation. Inside the patrol car, Officer Mike Williams, a man in his late 30s with an easy confidence, parked along the curb. Next to him, Officer Tom Anderson, a seasoned veteran with salt and pepper hair, leaned back in the passenger seat, scanning the street with a knowing smirk. Well, here we go, Tom muttered. Another day, another suspicious activity report. In the back seat, Rookie Officer Emily Grant clutched her notepad, her wide eyes betraying her curiosity. It's probably just another false alarm, right? She asked, trying to match her colleague's nonchalance. Mike chuckled softly as he stepped out of the car, his boots crunching on the gravel. You'd be surprised. People in small towns can turn a misplaced garbage can into a full-scale investigation. The trio approached the house across from Margaret's, its freshly painted exterior and elegant black shutters standing in stark contrast to the quaint charm of the older homes around it. The movers were gone, but the faint glow of light through the front windows suggested someone was home. From across the street, behind her carefully drawn curtains, Margaret Simmons peered through her binoculars, her pulse quickening. She watched as the three officers climbed the porch steps and knocked firmly on the door. "This is it," she whispered to herself, her voice trembling with a mix of vindication and nervousness. "Let's see what he's hiding." Inside the house, Michael Williams stood in his kitchen, pouring himself a glass of water, when the knock echoed through the room. He set the glass down calmly, his gaze shifting toward the front door. Through the window, he could see the police standing there, 3 of them. A faint smile tugged at the corner of his lips. That didn't take long. Michael moved to the door, his polished shoes clicking softly against the wooden floors. He paused for a moment before opening it, his expression composed, his demeanor poised. "Good evening, officers," he said smoothly, his deep voice steady as a heartbeat. "How can I help you?" The officers blinked, momentarily taken aback. Standing before them was a man who radiated authority and calm, a sharp contrast to the anxious suspects they usually encountered. Michael's tailored black slacks and crisp white shirt only heightened the sense that he was someone accustomed to being in charge. Officer Mike cleared his throat, stepping forward. "Good evening, sir. We received a call about, suspicious activity in the area." He glanced briefly at his notepad before continuing, "Reports of large items being moved into this house, and concerns raised by a resident about your presence here." Michael raised an eyebrow, his expression neutral but his eyes sharp. "Suspicious activity," he repeated slowly, as if testing the words. "Yes, sir," Mike replied. "We're just here to check in, ask a few questions, and make sure everything's in order." Michael regarded the officers for a long moment, his dark brown eyes unblinking. Finally, he stepped back and gestured toward the living room. "Well, then. By all means, come in." The officers exchanged quick glances. It wasn't every day that a resident, especially one under suspicion, invited them inside so readily. Thank you," Officer Tom said cautiously as they stepped over the threshold. From her window, Margaret nearly dropped her binoculars in disbelief. He let them inside. Why would he let them inside if he had something to hide? Her mind raced with conflicting thoughts, but she refused to abandon her suspicions. She adjusted the focus on the binoculars, trying to see through the partially closed blinds of Michael's windows. All she could make out were faint movements, shadows of figures inside. "Come on," she muttered under her breath. "Find something. Prove me right." Inside Michael's living room, the officers took stock of their surroundings. The house was impeccably organized, its minimalistic decor giving it a sense of both warmth and precision. A black grand piano sat majestically in one corner, its polished surface gleaming under the soft overhead light. On the walls hung a series of paintings, abstract yet tasteful. "So," Michael began, his voice breaking the silence. "What exactly was the concern raised about me?" Officer Mike shifted uncomfortably. "The report was vague, sir. Large boxes, unusual items, that kind of thing. A resident felt you might be, engaging in suspicious activities." Michael smiled faintly, though there was no humor in it. "And which resident would that be?" "We can't disclose that information," Officer Tom interjected quickly, trying to steer the conversation back on track. "It's standard procedure." Michael nodded thoughtfully. "Of course. Well, as you can see, officers, there's nothing out of the ordinary here. I just moved in today, and these," he gestured to the still unopened boxes stacked neatly in one corner, "are personal belongings." Emily, the rookie officer, finally spoke up. "Sir, may I ask what you do for a living?" Michael turned his gaze to her, his expression softening slightly. "You may. I'm in law enforcement." The room fell silent. Mike blinked. "Law enforcement?" Michael's smile returned, this time tinged with amusement. "Yes. I'm the new sheriff of Maplewood County." The words landed like a thunderclap. For a moment, none of the officers spoke. Mike's jaw slackened slightly, and Tom straightened up as if trying to process what he'd just heard. Emily's face turned bright red. "Wait, you're the new sheriff?" Mike finally managed. Michael nodded calmly. "That's correct. I start officially on Monday. I thought I'd take a few days to settle in first." Tom let out a low whistle, shaking his head with a bemused smile. "Well, I'll be damned. They didn't tell us the new sheriff was moving in today." Michael's expression remained calm, though his eyes gleamed with quiet satisfaction. "It seems the news didn't reach everyone." Across the street, Margaret's binoculars trembled slightly in her hands as she watched the officers emerge from Michael's house a few minutes later. To her surprise, and mounting confusion, they looked far more relaxed than when they'd arrived. "What's happening?" she whispered, her throat tightening. "Why aren't they arresting him?" She watched as the officers exchanged words with Michael on the front porch, even shaking his hand before turning back to their patrol car. Margaret lowered the binoculars, her chest heaving with frustration. "They didn't find anything," she muttered, disbelief coating her words. The patrol car rolled slowly down the street, disappearing around the corner. From her window, Margaret could still see Michael standing on his porch, his gaze turned toward her house. For a split second, Margaret could have sworn their eyes met. She stepped back from the window, her heart pounding. "Who is he?" she whispered. "And what is he hiding?" Her confidence had been shaken, but her curiosity, and suspicion, had only deepened. The evening after the police left felt heavier than usual in Maplewood. The golden light had faded into dusk, and the streetlights buzzed faintly as they flickered to life. The neighborhood was silent, but inside her pristine white house, Margaret Simmons couldn't rest. She sat by the window, her binoculars perched on the ledge, and watched the house across the street like a hawk. Michael's silhouette moved through the windows, faint against the warm glow of his lamps. He seemed unfazed by the earlier police visit, going about his evening as though nothing had happened. Margaret's frustration simmered. "How can he act so calm?" she muttered, pacing the room. "It doesn't make sense." She couldn't shake the memory of the officers leaving his house, their relaxed demeanor and polite handshakes. It gnawed at her, an itch she couldn't scratch. Her gut told her something wasn't right, and Margaret had learned long ago to trust her instincts. The next morning, Margaret decided she needed to speak to others. Surely she couldn't be the only one who felt uneasy. After all, Michael didn't fit the image of Maplewood. His confident air, the luxurious possessions, the grand piano, it was all too much. By mid-morning, Margaret found herself at the corner cafe, where the town's residents often gathered. The small shop was filled with the scent of coffee and fresh pastries, and the low hum of conversation swirled through the air. Margaret spotted three familiar faces, her friends Laura, Diane, and Helen, seated near the window. "Morning, ladies," Margaret said, sliding into the chair next to Laura. Her tone was unusually curt, and Laura raised an eyebrow. "Something wrong?" Diane asked, taking a sip of her coffee. Margaret leaned forward, lowering her voice. "It's about the new neighbor." The others exchanged wary glances. "What about him?" Laura asked. Margaret's voice dropped further, barely a whisper. "There's something off about him. I called the police yesterday." "You called the police?" Helen's eyes widened. "Margaret, why on earth?" "Because he's hiding something," Margaret cut in sharply. "You should have seen the things he brought into that house. Large boxes, strange items, and the way he carries himself. It's unsettling." Laura let out a sigh, clearly exasperated. "Margaret, we talked about this. You're jumping to conclusions. Not everyone has to fit in the way you think they should." Helen chimed in, though her tone was softer. "I heard he's just a new resident, settling in. He hasn't done anything wrong." Diane, however, seemed to consider Margaret's words. "What kind of boxes?" she asked, her curiosity piqued. "Big ones," Margaret replied quickly, "and heavy-looking. And there's something secretive about him. He doesn't belong here, I'm telling you." Diane frowned thoughtfully but said nothing further. Laura, meanwhile, shook her head. "Margaret, you're going to drive yourself mad over this. He's probably just a professional moving in with some fancy furniture. Let it go." But Margaret couldn't let it go. As she sat back in her chair, her friends' voices faded into background noise. Her mind spun with thoughts of Michael, his calmness, his secrecy, the way the officers had seemed so deferential to him. That afternoon, Margaret resumed her watch. Michael's daily activities became her obsession. She noted everything, the times he left the house, the cars that passed by, and even the occasional delivery that arrived at his doorstep. By sunset, Margaret's paranoia reached new heights. As the sky turned a deep shade of violet, she spotted something that made her breath catch. A black SUV pulled into Michael's driveway. It wasn't the same sleek vehicle he'd arrived in, it was larger, more imposing. Margaret pressed the binoculars to her face, straining to see. A man stepped out of the SUV, dressed in a dark suit and wearing sunglasses, even though the light was fading. He moved with a quiet confidence, much like Michael. After a brief exchange at the door, Michael let the man inside. "Who is that?" Margaret whispered to herself, her heart pounding. "What's going on over there?" She waited for the man to leave, but an hour passed, then two. The SUV remained parked in the driveway, its dark windows reflecting the streetlights like polished mirrors. Unable to sleep, Margaret made a decision. At close to midnight, she slipped on her coat and stepped outside. The crisp night air bit at her cheeks, but she didn't care. She needed to see what was happening for herself. Moving quietly, Margaret crossed the street, staying in the shadows cast by the towering oak trees. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she approached Michael's house, its front windows glowing faintly. The black SUV loomed nearby, its presence both unsettling and inexplicable. Margaret crept closer, hoping to get a better look. Suddenly, she heard a sound, footsteps. "Out for a stroll, Miss Simmons?" Margaret froze. Her breath caught as she turned to find Michael standing a few feet away, his silhouette sharp against the faint glow of his porch light. He was wearing a simple sweater and slacks, but his posture was as poised as ever. In his hand, he held a mug of something steaming. Margaret swallowed hard, her mouth dry. I couldn't sleep," she stammered. "Just getting some air." Michael's gaze was steady, unreadable. "Interesting time for a walk," he said mildly. "Is there something I can help you with?" Margaret shifted uncomfortably, searching for an answer. I was just curious. That car, the one in your driveway." "A friend," Michael interrupted, his tone polite but firm. "Nothing to be concerned about." Margaret felt her cheeks flush. "It just seems strange," she blurted out, her voice trembling slightly. "You move in, you bring all those boxes, and now someone shows up in the middle of the night." Michael tilted his head slightly, his expression softening. "Miss Simmons," he said quietly, "you've been watching me. I understand you're protective of your neighborhood. But I assure you, you have nothing to worry about." Margaret stared at him, her chest tight with frustration. "How do I know that?" she demanded. "Who are you, really?" Michael's faint smile returned, though there was something unsettling about it this time. "You'll know soon enough," he replied. "For now, I'd recommend you head back inside. It's cold out here, and you wouldn't want to catch a chill." Margaret opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Michael's calm demeanor left her unnerved, and she felt a sudden urge to retreat. "Good night, Miss Simmons," Michael said, turning toward his house. He paused, glancing back at her one last time. "And I'd appreciate it if you stayed on your side of the street." Margaret stood frozen, watching as Michael disappeared inside. The front door clicked shut, and the faint glow from the windows seemed to burn brighter, as if taunting her. Back inside her house, Margaret locked the door behind her, her hands trembling. Her encounter with Michael replayed in her mind, each word echoing louder than the last. "You'll know soon enough," she whispered to herself. "What does that mean?" She sank into her chair by the window, staring at the house across the street. For the first time in years, Margaret Simmons felt something she couldn't explain: fear. The dawn light crept hesitantly into Maplewood, casting long shadows over the quiet streets. Margaret Simmons sat at her kitchen table, staring into her untouched cup of tea. The events of the previous night replayed like a skipping record in her mind: Michael's calm, knowing gaze, his cryptic words, the way he had caught her so effortlessly in her late-night stroll. "You'll know soon enough." Margaret shuddered. The words refused to leave her. They followed her through the house like unseen whispers, filling every quiet corner. She spent the morning fussing with her garden, trimming flowers and pulling weeds with an unusual fervor, but her mind was miles away. She kept glancing at Michael's house across the street, as if expecting him to appear suddenly at the window, watching her. By lunchtime, the calm Maplewood routine she so cherished felt fractured. That afternoon, Margaret found herself walking into Laura Jones' living room uninvited, clutching her purse tightly to her chest. Laura was on the phone, but she quickly ended the call, eyeing her friend with concern. "Margaret, what on earth's gotten into you?" Laura asked, motioning for her to sit. Margaret ignored the offer. "Laura, I need you to listen to me," she said breathlessly. "It's about Michael." Laura sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. "Margaret, we've been over this. You're obsessing." "He's hiding something," Margaret cut her off. "I know what I saw. He had visitors last night, people showing up in strange cars. And his behavior, it's secretive, Laura." Laura crossed her arms, clearly unimpressed. "So, what do you expect me to do? Call another town meeting because our new neighbor owns a car?" Margaret's voice dropped to a desperate whisper. "I saw him with my own eyes, Laura. Last night. He was working on something. I don't know what, but it wasn't normal. There were tools, equipment, and these black files." Laura frowned, though she remained skeptical. "Files? Tools? What are you talking about?" Margaret wrung her hands. "I'm telling you, there's something big going on. People don't move to Maplewood with secrets unless they're running from something." Laura shook her head. "Margaret, you're chasing shadows. You need to calm down before you turn the whole neighborhood against him." But Margaret wasn't listening anymore. The seed of paranoia had grown roots, and it wouldn't be uprooted. That evening, the shadows in Maplewood stretched longer than usual, or so it seemed to Margaret. She sat by her living room window, binoculars in hand, her gaze glued to Michael's house. It had become a nightly ritual now, a vigil she couldn't abandon. Shortly after sunset, her pulse quickened when she saw movement. Michael appeared on his porch, dressed in a simple gray sweater and dark jeans. He carried a box, small but heavy-looking, and set it down near his garage. Then, to Margaret's astonishment, he opened the box and began pulling out what appeared to be tools, sharp, metallic, and unfamiliar. "What are you up to now?" Margaret whispered under her breath, her hands trembling as she adjusted the focus on her binoculars. Michael worked methodically, his expression unreadable. He moved inside, returning moments later with a set of folders in his hands, black folders that looked far too official for her liking. Margaret's mind spun. What could those files contain? Why tools at this hour? Suddenly, headlights flashed across her window as another car pulled into Michael's driveway. Margaret ducked reflexively, her heart racing. Peering cautiously back through the blinds, she saw a sleek black sedan come to a stop. A woman stepped out, a young professional, no older than 30. She wore a sharp navy suit and carried a leather briefcase. Her posture was straight, confident, and her expression was serious as she climbed the steps to Michael's porch. Margaret's pulse thundered in her ears as Michael opened the door. He greeted the woman with a nod, leading her onto the porch, where they began talking in low voices. Though Margaret couldn't hear their words, the tension between them was palpable. The woman gestured to the files in Michael's hand, her voice clipped and urgent. Michael listened calmly, occasionally glancing toward the street as if ensuring they weren't being watched. Margaret felt a chill crawl up her spine. What are they hiding? Margaret couldn't stop herself. Later that night, when the lights in Michael's house dimmed and the black sedan had disappeared into the night, Margaret slipped outside once more. The street was quiet, save for the faint rustle of wine through the trees. She crossed the road quickly, her footsteps muffled against the gravel. From the shadows of a tall oak tree, she peered at Michael's house. All was dark, save for a faint light coming from the back room. She crept closer, her heartbeat hammering in her chest. From the side of the house, she could just make out a faint outline through the half-closed blinds. Michael sat at a desk, the black folders open before him. He was studying their contents with intense focus, occasionally writing something down in a notebook. Margaret strained to see more, but the angle made it difficult. Suddenly, Michael stood, turned, and, Margaret froze, looked directly toward the window. Her breath caught. Had he seen her? Panicked, she stumbled back, brushing against the bush behind her with a sharp rustle. She stayed frozen for a moment, her heart pounding painfully against her ribs. When nothing happened, she exhaled shakily and turned back toward her house, her footsteps hurried and uneven. Then she stopped dead. Parked a short distance away, almost hidden beneath the shadow of an oak, was the black SUV, the same one she'd seen the night before. Its windows were dark, the vehicle so still it seemed to be watching her. Margaret's skin prickled with fear. She hurried across the street, her steps frantic now, and let herself into her house, locking the door behind her. Inside, she pressed her back against the door, her breathing ragged. For the first time, Margaret felt something more than suspicion or paranoia, she felt fear. "Who is he?" she whispered aloud, her voice trembling in the empty room. "And what does he want here?" Her encounter with Michael earlier now loomed larger in her mind. His calm confidence, his choice of words, "You'll know soon enough," it all pointed to something deeper, something far beyond her understanding. As Margaret glanced back toward her window, she swore she saw a shadow move across Michael's porch. Whether it was real or a trick of the light, she couldn't tell. All she knew was that Michael Williams wasn't just a man with expensive furniture and late-night visitors. He was something else entirely. And Margaret Simmons was determined to find out what. The following morning, Maplewood was cloaked in fog, the mist weaving like ghostly fingers through the streets. It was the kind of morning Margaret Simmons usually loved, a time for quiet reflection, tending to her flowers, and savoring a hot cup of tea. But today, the fog felt different. It pressed against her windows, dense and suffocating, a mirror of the unease that had taken root in her mind. Margaret had barely slept the night before. She kept replaying the black SUV, the woman on Michael's porch, and the chilling feeling that she had been watched. Every creak of her house had startled her, every shadow in the dark corners made her pulse race. Her head ached from the sleepless night, but even as exhaustion pulled at her limbs, she couldn't stop herself from watching. Through the haze, Michael's house looked like a fortress, silent and impenetrable. Yet it betrayed no secrets. There were no cars in the driveway this morning. No visitors. No activity at all. Margaret squinted through her binoculars. Where is he? Her phone buzzed on the table beside her, breaking the silence. She glanced down to see Laura's name on the screen. Not now, Margaret muttered, silencing the call. Laura wouldn't understand. Nobody would. Margaret's gaze returned to the house across the street. The fog curled along the edges of Michael's lawn like an omen, and Margaret made a decision, one that sent a nervous tremor through her hands. If he's gone, this is my chance. By late morning, the fog had begun to lift, leaving behind a damp chill. Margaret stood at her window, waiting. She saw Michael step out of his front door, dressed in his usual crisp, composed attire, a simple shirt, slacks, and polished shoes. He walked calmly to his SUV, climbed inside, and drove off without looking back. Margaret's heart began to pound. This is it. Moving with a focus that bordered on frantic, she grabbed a light jacket and slipped into her loafers. She checked the street, empty, and then stepped outside. The sound of her shoes crunching softly on gravel made her hyper-aware of how quiet everything was. Her neighbors were nowhere to be seen, most busy with their lives or tucked indoors. Margaret crossed the street quickly, her hands shaking slightly as she approached Michael's house. The front yard, though neat, felt cold and uninviting. She avoided the porch, choosing instead to circle around to the side of the house. Just a quick look, she whispered to herself. I'm not doing anything wrong. She reached the side gate and pushed it open slowly, wincing at the creak of the hinge. The backyard was empty, dominated by a modest garden and a detached garage with a heavy steel door. Margaret's eyes fixed on the garage. That's where he works. Taking one last glance at the street to ensure no one was watching, Margaret approached the garage door and pressed on the handle. It was unlocked. The door groaned softly as it opened, revealing the interior of the space. The garage was far from what Margaret had expected. It wasn't filled with ordinary tools or storage boxes. Instead, the space was meticulously organized, almost too clean. A workbench stood against the far wall, littered with carefully arranged items, sleek metal tools, files, notebooks, and a laptop that sat closed in the center. Margaret's pulse quickened. She moved toward the workbench, her eyes darting across its contents. The tools looked strange, complex, specialized, and bore no resemblance to the kind of things an average homeowner would use. Nearby, several files were stacked haphazardly. One, labeled "Confidential" in bold black letters, caught her eye. She reached for it, her hand trembling. As she opened the folder, her breath caught. Inside were printed documents filled with typed reports, maps, and photographs of locations Margaret didn't recognize. Some pages contained what appeared to be police codes and legal references. Others were handwritten notes in a precise, deliberate script. Margaret's mind raced. What is this? What is he doing here? Her eyes landed on a map, its edges smudged with ink. At the center, a series of red circles had been drawn around nearby counties, including Maplewood. Words like operations, threats, and surveillance were scrawled across the margins. The word sheriff appeared more than once, underlined. Margaret's mouth went dry. Her thoughts spiraled. Is he spying on us? The sound of a car door slamming outside sent Margaret into a panic. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. Heavy footsteps crunched on the gravel outside the garage. No. He's back. Margaret shoved the folder shut and glanced around in desperation, searching for a place to hide. But it was too late. The steel door creaked open behind her, and a shadow fell across the room. Ms. Simmons, Michael's voice said evenly. Margaret whipped around, her face pale. Michael stood in the doorway, his hands in his pockets. He wasn't angry, but his expression was unreadable, calm, composed, yet carrying an edge that made her stomach turn. "What are you doing here?" he asked quietly. I was just," Margaret stammered, her voice cracking. She gestured weakly at the garage. I thought something was wrong." Michael stepped inside, his gaze locking onto hers. "You thought something was wrong? So you decided to break into my garage?" Margaret opened her mouth, but no words came. Her thoughts were a mess, her panic growing. Michael took a step closer, and though his tone remained calm, there was no mistaking the authority behind his voice. "Ms. Simmons, I've been patient with you. I know you've been watching me. I know you've been spreading rumors to the neighbors." Margaret's heart pounded in her chest. I was just trying to protect Maplewood." Michael's expression softened slightly, though his eyes remained sharp. "Protect Maplewood? From me?" He let out a quiet sigh, shaking his head. "I'm not your enemy, Ms. Simmons. But breaking into my property? That's a line you shouldn't have crossed." Margaret felt her knees weaken. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice barely above a whisper. Michael regarded her for a long moment before speaking. "I'm exactly who I said I am. But perhaps it's time you stop worrying about things that aren't your concern." He gestured to the door. "I suggest you leave." Margaret hesitated, her fear clashing with her stubbornness. But one look at Michael's steady gaze sent her scrambling out of the garage, her steps unsteady as she rushed back to her house. Inside her living room, Margaret sank into her armchair, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She felt equal parts terrified and furious. She thought of the locked folders, the strange tools, the maps. "He's hiding something," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I know it. I saw it." She looked back across the street. Michael's house stood silent again, his garage door now firmly shut. But Margaret could still feel his gaze, calm, watchful, lingering in her mind. Her obsession had brought her this far, and she knew she couldn't stop now. She had crossed a line. There was no going back. "I'll find out," she vowed, gripping the arm of her chair. "I'll find out the truth." Outside, a shadow moved behind Michael's drawn blinds. Whether it was real or imagined, Margaret couldn't tell. All she knew was that the truth was close, dangerously close. The crisp morning air carried a strange weight as Margaret Simmons paced nervously in her living room. She hadn't slept again, not truly, her thoughts consumed by the encounter in Michael's garage, the locked files, the tools, and his cryptic warnings. Every moment replayed itself, twisting into something darker with each passing hour. Margaret felt trapped. It wasn't enough to watch anymore. She needed answers, and she needed the neighborhood to see what she saw. "Enough is enough," she muttered aloud, a frantic resolve in her voice. "If the police won't take this seriously, I'll make them listen." Margaret picked up her phone and began making calls. By mid-afternoon, an unusual buzz had settled over Elmwood Lane. Small clusters of neighbors stood on sidewalks, whispering in hushed tones. Word had spread quickly. Margaret had arranged an impromptu meeting to discuss a pressing issue in the community. It wasn't every day that the peace of Maplewood was disturbed, and curiosity had drawn nearly a dozen people to Margaret's front yard. Laura was among them, her arms crossed and her expression skeptical as she watched her friend move through the crowd, greeting each person with a mix of nervous energy and determination. Diane and Helen stood near the back, murmuring to one another while glancing occasionally toward Michael's house. Margaret stepped onto her porch, raising her hands to quiet the small group. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice trembling slightly but growing stronger as she spoke. "We need to talk about what's happening in our neighborhood, about the man who moved into the house across the street." A ripple of murmurs passed through the crowd. Laura frowned, shaking her head. "Margaret," she muttered under her breath, "what are you doing?" Margaret pressed on, her face flushed. "I know some of you think I'm overreacting, but I've seen things, strange visitors at all hours, locked files, tools that don't belong in a house like that. He's hiding something from us, and we deserve to know what it is." The crowd grew restless, shifting uneasily as Margaret's voice grew sharper. "I've tried to look out for Maplewood for years. We've built a safe, peaceful community here, and now that peace is at risk." "Is it?" Laura interrupted loudly, her tone full of frustration. "Margaret, you don't even know him. You've been spying and making assumptions with no real proof." Margaret glared at her friend, refusing to back down. I know what I saw. And if we let someone like that stay here unchecked, we'll regret it. She pointed toward Michael's house, her hand shaking. He needs to answer for what he's been doing. The group turned as the front door of Michael's house opened. The man himself stepped outside, his calm and composed presence immediately commanding the crowd's attention. He wore a simple dark jacket and jeans, but he moved with an unmistakable authority as he walked toward Margaret's yard. The murmurs quieted. For a long, tense moment, Michael stood before the crowd, his gaze sweeping over them, firm but not unkind. Finally, he spoke. I see I'm the topic of discussion, he said quietly, his deep voice carrying effortlessly. Margaret stepped forward, emboldened by the crowd's silence. You've been acting suspiciously since you arrived, she said, her voice wavering only slightly. Strange boxes, people visiting late at night, files you won't explain. What are you hiding? Michael's gaze turned to Margaret, unreadable but steady. He took a deep breath before speaking, his tone calm and measured. I'm not hiding anything. My name is Michael Williams, and I'm the newly appointed sheriff of Maplewood County. The crowd gasped collectively. Even Margaret froze, her face draining of color. Michael continued, stepping closer so his words carried no doubt. Those files you've seen. Those tools. They're part of an ongoing investigation. I was sent here, quietly, to dismantle an organized crime network operating across several counties. That work brought me here to Maplewood. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the group. I was advised to keep a low profile until my team and I finished preparations. I never imagined I'd become the center of a neighborhood conspiracy. The silence was deafening. Diane glanced at Helen, her eyes wide. Laura turned to Margaret, her expression a mix of disbelief and anger. You're the sheriff? Margaret whispered faintly, her voice cracking. Yes, Michael replied simply. And while I understand your concern for the community, Ms. Simmons, you let your assumptions get the better of you. His gaze softened slightly, though his voice remained firm. I've sworn to protect this county, including Maplewood. That includes protecting you from actual threats, not imagined ones. Margaret felt as though the ground had been pulled out from beneath her. Her throat tightened painfully. Michael looked out at the crowd. There's a lesson to be learned here, for all of us, he said, his voice steady. Trust is fragile. Judgments can be made far too quickly. I moved here to do my job, but instead of being welcomed, I was met with suspicion because I didn't fit an image some of you are used to. The crowd was silent, his words hanging in the air like a heavy mist. Michael turned back to Margaret, his expression unreadable. Ms. Simmons, you love this community. I can see that. But loving a place means welcoming change and giving people the benefit of the doubt. Margaret opened her mouth, but no words came. Shame burned hot in her chest, and for the first time in years, Margaret Simmons had no response. The meeting ended quietly, the neighbors dispersing in small groups, whispering to one another about the revelation. Michael returned to his house, leaving Margaret standing alone on her porch, staring at the empty street. Laura approached her, her expression soft but firm. Margaret, what were you thinking? Margaret shook her head slowly, tears stinging her eyes. I thought I was doing the right thing. Laura sighed, squeezing Margaret's shoulder. Sometimes, the right thing is just listening before jumping to conclusions. The following day, Margaret stood outside Michael's house, clutching a plate of cookies in her trembling hands. The walk across the street felt longer than it ever had, and by the time she reached the front door, her palms were slick with sweat. She knocked softly. Michael opened the door, his calm expression unchanged. Ms. Simmons. Margaret swallowed hard. I came to apologize, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I was wrong, and I'm sorry. Michael studied her for a moment before accepting the plate with a small nod. Thank you, Ms. Simmons. Margaret turned to leave but stopped, glancing back. I'd like to start over, if you'll let me. I suppose change isn't always a bad thing. Michael's faint smile returned. It's never too late to change. Over the next few weeks, Maplewood began to settle into its rhythm again. Michael became a familiar sight, walking the streets, talking to neighbors, and, in time, earning their trust. Margaret, too, began to change. She learned to listen more and assume less. And though the shadows of her mistakes still lingered, Margaret Simmons realized something profound. Sometimes the greatest justice isn't delivered by authority but by confronting the biases that live within ourselves.